Let me teach you everything you need to know about working with Swagger in a Spring Boot application. There's going to be a two-part video. The first part, which is this one, I'm going to teach you what Swagger is and why you would need to use it. After that, we're going to learn the step-by-step process for integrating Swagger into a Spring Boot application and kind of generate API documentation out of the box. Let's get started. You think you know Swagger? Well, you might be in for a bit of a surprise because Swagger is a little more than what most people think of it as. Well, Swagger is this vast set of open source tools that can help you with API development in general, okay? It has tons of tools to help you with developing APIs, working with APIs, making calls to them, and finally, documenting APIs. This third thing is what has given Swagger its popularity. It's an excellent tool for documenting APIs. It has various ways in which you can document it, and the most popular way is using something called Swagger-UI. When most people think of Swagger, they only think of Swagger-UI, but Swagger is more than that. However, in this video, we're going to be focusing on this popular part. We're going to be focusing on the documentation part of Swagger. We will learn how to use Swagger to document our Spring Boot APIs. Let's get the basic question out of the way first, okay? Why do we need a tool for documenting APIs? Well, the scenario is this. Let's say you're an API developer, you have a Spring Boot application that has the APIs with you. It has all the controllers and the API endpoints and all that stuff. Now, you ask another developer who's the consumer of this API to access this API that you've created. So the guy who needs to use the API is going to come to you and ask you some questions. They're going to be like, okay, what are the endpoints that are available to him? What are the response codes that those endpoints would provide? What are the methods? What is the payload structure that they would need to provide? What's the response structure they're going to get? What are the error conditions that they might have to handle? Man, does this guy have a lot of questions. The quickest way to answer all these questions is to prepare a document and write down all the details of your API and the contract and all that stuff and hand it over to them. Because if there's one thing that all developers love, it's writing documentation all the time, right? Well, there's also this additional problem of even if someone were to write the documentation, what happens if the API gets updated? Then they're going to have to update the documentation all the time, and they have to make sure it's always in sync. So this is going to be a constant and consistent problem to solve. This has typically been a problem with API development in general, and the popular API technology that we had before REST was something called SOAP. And SOAP had documentation standardized using something called WSDL, right? It was an XML, lots and lots and lots of XML. However, REST APIs don't have such strict requirements for documentation and strict specifications. So in general, that's a good thing, but we still need to have something that can auto-generate API documentation. And this is where Swagger documentation tools come into the picture. This is how Swagger works. Swagger allows you to create auto-generated documentation based on metadata that you have in your code. All right, so you add Swagger metadata to your code, and you tell it what the APIs are, what they should be used for, what the parameters are, and so on. There's actually a lot of information that Swagger can infer from your code and method signatures directly, but you can add more metadata and add these things like API description or any notes that you want the consumers of the API to know and all that stuff. Once you've done that, there is a process that takes all this metadata and takes the code itself and generates elegant documentation in various different forms, from JSON to fully readable HTML directly. Okay, developers just write the metadata and the tool builds the documentation. The reason this is awesome is if the API changes for some reason, right? The developer just has to update the metadata for the changed API. And then the Swagger tooling takes care of updating the documentation. So as long as you're generating the documentation with each build, there's no problem with outdated documentation or manual efforts anymore. You don't have to update the documentation yourself. All right, so now that we have the benefits of Swagger understood, let's look at how we add Swagger to a Spring Boot application. All right, so how do you get it to document your Spring Boot APIs? Well, here are the steps. The first step is to get the Swagger to Spring dependency. there is a specific dependency that you need to get added to the class path, and that's what's going to be doing all the work. Swagger, by the way, is a specification for documentation, and there are different implementations for it. You're going to be getting the Spring implementation of Swagger, because Swagger can be used in various other languages, various other platforms, not necessarily Spring. So when you're using Swagger with Spring, you add the Spring dependency of Swagger. There is a specific dependency called Springfox that we're going to be adding, by the way. All right, so next step is to enable Swagger in your Spring Boot application. As you can imagine, with Spring Boot, you just have to stick an annotation in there, and then you have Swagger enabled. We'll look at that. And then that should be sufficient for generating some out-of-the-box documentation. Swagger is going to look at your API methods, your controllers, and all that stuff, and kind of figure out some basic documentation, but you can have it do more. You can configure Swagger to specifically say, hey, look at this package, or look at this sets of APIs and all that stuff. So we're going to be looking at that too. And then the final step, which is also optional, is you can add more details as annotations to your APIs. The API structure is going to inform Swagger about what the APIs should be. But then you can add notes, for example. You can say, hey, this API is for doing this, and then don't use this API, use this other thing instead. So you can add these little notes and add more information to your API, to your model objects and all that stuff as annotations to those APIs. So we're going to be looking at that one too. All right, so let's get started. We're going to start by creating a Spring Boot project. Once I've created it, I'll open it in IntelliJ. If you're not familiar with how to create a Spring Boot project from the scratch, refer to this card that's showing up out here for step-by-step instructions. All right, so now I have this project open in Spring Boot. It's called Spring Boot Swagger-2 application. And all I've done here is if I open the pom.xml, you see here I just have this web dependency. That's it, right? It has no dependency, no Swagger stuff. It's just a simple web application. And now we're going to be adding some APIs for it. In order to document APIs, we need some APIs in there in the first place. So I'm going to be adding like a contact API, right? So I'm going to address book API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this address book resource. Basically, it has it'll have like 3 API endpoints. One is for getting all the contacts. One is for getting a contact given an ID. And the other is for posting a contact so that it gets added to the list. All right, so I'm going to go here. And here's my address book resource that I've created. Just an empty class. I have 3 methods here. Get contact, which takes in an ID, returns a contact. Get all contacts, which returns a list of contacts. And then the third thing is the add contact, which takes in a contact as an argument. And it just returns it blindly, of course, but then it also adds it to the list on the server. Now I'm going to be adding a bunch of annotations for this to make these API endpoints. The first thing is the rest of controller, of course. And then annotations on top of each of these, get mapping with the ID, get mapping with slash, and post mapping with slash. So basically what I'm doing here is when you do a get request at the root, you're going to get all the contacts. When you do a get request with the root slash ID, you're going to get that specific ID, the contact with that specific ID. And then when you do a post to the root with contact information in the payload, it is going to add it to the list. All right, I have mapped this to the root URL, and that's intentional because I'll be changing it later and I'll tell you why. All right, but remember this. For now, we're just operating off of the root URL. Now I need something to implement this contacts list. I'm not going to be doing database and all that stuff because it's not the scope of this particular video. We will be using like a concurrent hash map and save all the contacts in memory. All right. So when I'm adding a contact, I'm going to put it to the concurrent hash map. When I'm looking up a contact, I'm going to be looking up from that hash map, and then getting all contacts is basically getting all the values. All right. So I'm going to be using that hash map implementation. I'm going to create this concurrent hash map in memory, and then the get of a particular ID is contacts.get. Get all contacts is just contacts.values put into an array list. And then putting a contact is basically contacts.put of an ID and the contact. So it's basically a map of a particular ID and the contact information. As you can notice here, I'm assuming there is a contact class. So I'm going to be creating that contact model class as well. So here is the contact class with the ID, name, and phone. Nothing too fancy here. It's basic Spring MVC and basic Spring REST. I'm just using this because it's a good API starting point to document with Swagger. All right, so now I'm going to access this API using Postman. I'll be using Postman client for making these REST API calls. If you're not familiar with Postman, it's just like a REST API client for making calls to the APIs. If you're making GET requests, you can do this in any browser, but if you're making POST requests, a good API client is handy, and I'm going to be using Postman. So this is what it looks like, right? So you have a place where you can put in a URL. I'm going to be putting localhost :8080. I'm going to be doing a GET request. It's obviously empty. Now I'm going to do a POST request to this to put a contact in there. I'm going to put a couple of contacts. So in the body, I am going to choose raw, and then here is this raw payload of ID, name, and phone, which is basically what the contact model requires. I'm going to put the header as content type is application JSON, because it's required to make these JSON calls. And then, of course, with this in the body, I'm going to hit send, and it is going to save this contact for Mr. Foo. I'm going to have a Mr. Bar as well, ID bar, Mr. Bar. Say you send one more, so we have 2 contacts saved. As you can see here, it's returning the payload. But now if I were to get at the root this time, it's going to return me these 2 contacts, right, that I've just saved. And I can also look for, I'm going to remove this payload because we don't need this for making a GET request, right? GET for URL returns those 2. And then I can access a particular ID, and then I'm going to get that particular contact, all right? We have 3 APIs. Now on to the actual fun stuff. How do we add Swagger and have it generate documentation for these 3 API endpoints? Well, let's look at those steps. Step 1 is adding the Swagger dependency. Like I said, we're going to be adding the Swagger dependency for Spring Boot. And the Swagger dependency is Springfox-swagger-UI. All right, so I'm going to open this up in Maven Central. So here's what Maven Central says. Springfox-swagger-UI, the dependency version is 2.9. So I'm going to be copying that dependency version and adding it to my pom.xml. I'm going to put it just above the test dependency over here. All right, so Springfox-swagger-UI 2.9.2 is the version. Import my changes IntelliJ. Thank you very much. And then once it's downloaded, you have the Springfox-swagger dependency added to your class path. That's step 1. All right, now let's move on to step 2, enabling Swagger in your Spring Boot application. Like I mentioned before, it's as simple as just sticking an annotation in there. So we're going to be doing that. I'm going to go to this main application, which has the main method. And here I'm going to stick this annotation called enable Swagger-UI. And that's it. Swagger-UI is enabled. And the dependency is, of course, from the Springfox package, which is what we just added, right? This was the dependency that we just added. This is what we're going to be importing from. If you're doing this in a real world application, I would recommend not putting this in the root class. I would probably create like a config class and put it there, but it works anyway. You have to have this annotation somewhere, right? So you have to have the enable Swagger-UI annotation somewhere, and then Swagger is enabled. Now we can restart the server, and then after you've restarted the server, access the same thing. In Postman, you have the same APIs, but now this time you're going to get an additional API in your web application thanks to Swagger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to access that API over here, localhost 8000 v2 API-docs. All right, so this is the new API endpoint, documentation endpoint that Swagger has added. Take a look at this, JSON documentation. It has a bunch of properties about what this is. It has the host, base URL is /. All right, I'm going to collapse the tag section here. So here you see the path section is what's really interesting. You have the root URL path. You have a get, and it has the summary as get all contacts. So it's basically inferring the stuff from your method names. All right, so it doesn't have summary to tell the reader, but it's inferring a bunch of stuff. It has a bunch of responses that it can provide. And that's kind of like Spring MVC out of the box, whatever it supports. And then you have the post at the root URL. And then again, you have the add contact. And then you have the parameter, which is whatever you want to put in the body. Here's the interesting thing. It's going to tell you what the schema of your post body should be. Its schema is contact. I'm going to show that in just a little bit. You have a /error, which is again the Spring Boot default. You have a /ID, which is the third API that we have exposed, which is get contact. And then here is the definition section. This is the schema of your different model objects. We have one model object here, which is contact. It has these 3 fields. So it's going to tell you exactly what you need to send in order to make those calls. bunch of error codes, response codes, and all that good stuff. So yeah, we have JSON documentation right there. This is great, but Swagger can do some more stuff. It can do much more stuff, actually. It can provide human-readable HTML documentation, kind of using the same principles. So what we added as dependency was for generating JSON documentation. You can have another dependency that generates HTML documentation. It's not just documentation which is readable, you can actually interact with it, which is super cool, and that's kind of what caused Swagger to be super popular. So let me show you how that looks like. So the dependency for adding HTML documentation in your Spring Boot application is Springfox-swagger-UI. All right, so again, it's the same dependency, 2.9.2. So I'm going to be adding that to my pom.xml. I'm going to go right there below Swagger 2. I'm going to have Springfox-swagger-UI, import the changes. Okay, now with this, just with adding this dependency, you now have an endpoint at the root URL, which has the Swagger HTML documentation. But here's the problem. I have a root URL API mapped to my address book application. So it's going to take over all requests coming to the root URL. So what I need to do is take my API out of the root. So what I'm going to do here is go over to the REST controller. I'm going to add a request mapping with a path as /API so that I'm listening to /API and I'm not completely taking over the root URL. So now this allows requests to get in and have Swagger UI handle at the root URL. All right, so I'm going to be restarting my application. This URL, localhost 8080 Swagger UI.html. All right, so it's the .html file at the root URL. You see, this is why I had to move the API out. Now I can access this root URL .html, and then here you see Swagger UI in all its glory. It's not very fancy, of course, but there are a couple of cool tricks it has up its sleeve. So we're going to start with looking at the title, which is API documentation. Very generic title because we haven't even told it what our application name is, right? It has no idea. We can do all that stuff, but let's take a look at this guy here. There are two APIs that this thing has exposed. One is the address book resource, and then the basic error controller. So there are categories of APIs, all right? So I'm going to expand this address book resource. And here you see there are 3 API endpoints, which is exactly what we need. So I can expand these and it provide more details. And here is the cool thing. You can actually try it out. You can click on the try it out button. You can actually make these API calls. All right. So here is the post to the root URL. In order to make an API endpoint, I'm going to do that first. All right. So I'm going to post. It auto fills the JSON syntax for your model, and then I'm just going to add the same values over here because we restarted the server, right? Ours is an in-memory database. All that contact information we added last time is gone. So I'm going to adding this, execute, make a post request, and look at this. It's actually made the post request, return the response that you can read in HTML, right? So we don't need Postman anymore. You can access this directly in Swagger, and see here is the request URL that you send. Here is the response that you get. And let me add one more. Bar, Mr. Bar, and execute. And now here we get the same response body. I'm going to go to get now. Get all contacts, try it out. Click on the execute button here. Then look at this. We have the response right here. So this is super cool in my opinion. You're actually making these API calls in your documentation directly, right? So it's not just a read-only thing. I'm going to add this, try this out as well. Foo. Execute, and here is the payload. So this page, which Swagger UI generated with literally no information that we provided to it, right? So we didn't give it any metadata, nothing like that. We just enabled Swagger in our Spring Boot application, added the right responses, and then it was just there. This basic error controller are the APIs that come with Spring MVC. So it's got all the stuff. Model shows all the model objects that we have. So here is the contact model object. Again, you remember, kind of tie it back to the resource schema value that we saw in JSON. It's basically showing that in a nice readable format. It's saying, okay, these are the model objects that you have. You have contact, and then you have a bunch of stuff from Spring MVC that's coming out of the box, right? So you have the error endpoints from Spring MVC. You have a couple of models, model in view and view. These are also coming out of the box from Spring MVC. That's also documented over here. Okay, so this was just bare bones Swagger. I think it's really cool how much we got with just adding a couple of dependencies and one annotation. We just got this automated API documentation that's always updated. So whoever is consuming your API can always point to that endpoint and get the latest state of documentation, and nobody has to write documentation manually. However, the HTML documentation page that was generated is less than ideal. For example, there are Spring MVC related endpoints and resources that we'd like to remove. And then the labeling, the name and the description is very, very generic. What if you want to add more details and add more context? Well, we'll fix that in the next video, but I'll talk about how you can customize your API endpoints to provide more information to Swagger and generally get better and much more readable API documentation. So see you there.